Hello, this is Resource of the Week with SolanoConnex, Mental Health, Service Access, and You. My name is Valentina Kelly.
And I'm Elena Starr. And this week we are welcoming back Dr. Norma Rodriguez de Lisenko for our third episode of our very special four-part series for May as Mental Health Awareness Month. Those of you who don't know, Norma, who's been with us for the last couple of weeks, is the Chief Executive Officer for Innovative Health Solutions. And this week she's going to be sharing her experiences with addiction, substance use, and recovery. Good morning, Norma. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you all for having me. This has been a really great journey to be with you guys.
We're so happy to have you again. And just for a quick recap for those who may just be jumping in this week and haven't listened to the other episodes, do you mind just sharing briefly just who you are?
Yes. So as you mentioned, I run Innovative Health Solutions, which is a nonprofit in Solano County. I'm the CEO and founder of a nonprofit. I have three beautiful, almost adult kids, and I have been a public health advocate for over 20 years, and specifically advocating children's health, families' health, and and the health of our communities.
Thank you, Norma. And before we go into the next question that we have for you, I just wanted to give a quick disclaimer. This week's theme, as we mentioned, is addiction and substance use. And we just want to remind everyone, we aren't medical professionals, but Norma is sharing her personal experiences with us. And so thank you, Norma, also for doing that. And our next question is, who are you in terms of how addiction affected your life?
Yes, so I developed an addiction and dependency to alcohol at the late age of 40. So this is the first time that I speak publicly about my addiction to alcohol. And what I didn't know is that alcoholism runs in my family. Both my paternal and maternal grandfathers were alcoholics, which I didn't know because I never met them. And so I also didn't know that anybody could develop an addiction to alcohol at a later age. And because at the age of 40, similarly to now that I turned 50, I was dealing with an intense bout of depression. Then I all of a sudden started using alcohol as a way to self-medicate and go through that depression. So what I've learned once I went to recovery is that alcoholism is actually in people's DNA as a gene, but sometimes, like in my case, it can be dormant. This gene can be dormant for many years. So in my case, I was dormant for 40 years. So then it's when I turned 40 is when it kind of became, active, I guess. So I didn't know that. And so research shows that people who develop alcoholism is because 50% of that is related to genetics. So that was something new that I didn't know. What I did know about my alcohol consumption is that I was never a happy drinker, meaning that once I went over drinking too much alcohol, I just became either sad or angry or depressed. And so what I did also know is that I didn't have that shut off mechanism that normal drinkers have, meaning that some people, after they've drank so much of, whatever, 3, 4, whatever it is, they just know when to stop. My system doesn't know where to stop. So it wants more and more. So that's also abnormal. And then the other thing that I did know about me that was no normal is that I would then get blackouts, meaning that blackouts are moments where your memory just goes, there's gaps in memories. I had those when I went into a lot of drinking. So those are the three things that I did know about me. But again, because I didn't know that I had this alcoholism gene in my family or the history, because growing up, I didn't experience anyone around me, my dad, my mom, no one was an alcoholic around me. So therefore, I didn't know that I could then, in later years in my life, would develop alcoholism. So that's my experience with alcohol.
Thank you, Norma. Thank you so much for sharing. And could you tell us a little bit about why you wanted to talk about addiction and substance use due to your depression?
Yes. So again, just like we've been doing throughout this month, is just to bring more awareness. I personally know that it's so important to talk openly in a safe space about mental health conditions. And addiction is another mental health condition.
Yeah.
And so this is something that when we don't talk about it openly in a safe space, it becomes something that where people, when they are going through it, they isolate and it becomes a dark secret, right? And what I've learned in my recovery is that one of the worst things that someone who deals with a dark secret is that it's like the anthem that they tell us is like, we are as sick as our darkest secret, meaning that when you keep a secret in the dark, it keeps growing and becomes more harmful, right? Because it has more power over you. Therefore, once you expose this secret in a safe space, then now it has no power over you, right? So in my case, alcohol had this weird power over me. And so once I started sharing at the beginning, when I was going through recovery, I would share with my closest friends and families. And I had a therapist and all of that. But as I became to heal from that, I started sharing it more and more and more. And so now that I'm, sharing it in this public space, what is helpful for me is because then it brings healing to that area of my mental health, condition. So the more I speak about it, the more we talk about it, the less power this condition has over us. So I think that's why it's important to speak about it in a very, again, safe space. Also, something that why is because, again, what I shared before is that it happened to me when I turned 40. So it's not like you have to live with it all your life. It's like it could be in a very specific time in your life, and then all of a sudden you don't even know that is happening. So now that I turned 50 and that I'm dealing with the bout of depression, I understand that. So obviously this addiction to and dependency to alcohol is not coming back because I'm very aware of it. And so I use other tools instead of self-medicating with alcohol. Another thing why it's important to talk about why is triggers in our lives, right? Transitions in lives are those environmental triggers that I think we need to be very aware of. And the only way we can be aware of is by talking about it. So as I mentioned to you, I turned 40, the bout of depression. I turned 50, dealing with the bout of depression. So I think that it's important that we talk about that so that we can then learn about our imbalances in life and kind of try to help us become more balanced, right? Or use different ways to alleviate depression or addiction. And one of the things too is that I didn't know that I had a family history with alcoholism. So how would I be able to develop the tools that I needed to make sure that I prevent that from happening? So now that I understand more about mental health issues, the more I realize that it's more important to speak about it, to remove the stigma that depression and addiction, alcoholism, or even addiction to any other substances have. And so we can start normalizing these conversations.
Yeah, no, I think it's so important. I mean, as you've mentioned, even throughout the series, it's so important to talk about these things because, as you mentioned, if we don't talk about it, sometimes they can have this hold over us that just kind of keeps you captive in a lot of ways. And so I really appreciate you sharing that, Norma. So next, we're going to ask you about what addiction looked like for you. However, before we start that, we just want to remind everyone that addiction is really complicated. And just a very brief definition is that addiction is a compulsive physical need to do or consume something. And so, Norma, can you share us a little bit about what that looked like for you?
Yes, so addiction is usually connected, as you mentioned, it's connected to a negative something, right? A negative to substance use, drug use. We all talk about addiction in a very negative connotation. And so comes with the stigma. So therefore, people don't speak about it. But for the purpose of these videos, I want to make sure that people understand that addiction comes in different forms. A person could also be addicted to food, unhealthy relationships, unhealthy habits, or things like exercise or going for a walk or drinking water, right? So research shows that addiction is a change in our brain system of so what happens is when we use one thing, like, I don't know, we'll talk about exercise, for example. If we exercise every single day for, say, a couple of hours a day, it's something that our brain gets overwhelmed with, right? This exercise process. So because then it becomes we give it too much of that, then the release of dopamine increases. And so it gets to a point where it changes your brain to where now your brain needs that release of dopamine on a daily basis, right? And so exercise could be a negative addiction as well. And people don't realize that, because when you're young and you're exercising, you think, okay, yes, this is great. But then when you get older and now you're having arthritis, you're having joint pain, you're having to have surgery because your joints, right? So you realize that the more you do it, the more your body is not able to hold, withstand that. So that could be a negative addiction too. But going back to that moment in my life when I became addicted to depending on alcohol, I also developed another addiction, which was addiction to caffeine. So what would happen to me is that during the day, I would drink like several cups of coffee in the morning. Then during lunchtime, I would move into drinking a Diet Coke, like a big bottle of Diet Coke. Again, I was chasing that caffeine. My brain was making me chase that caffeine feeling, right? And so then, because I was high on caffeine, then in the evening, I started drinking alcohol to suppress that feeling, right? Because I couldn't be all alert in the evening. And so I would use alcohol to suppress that. And I was doing this on a daily basis. That was my routine: caffeine up until a certain time, and then alcohol after a while. So I did that for 6 months. And so until I realized, oh, shoot, I'm in trouble now, because now my brain wanted more of the alcohol. So I think that, again, going back to the triggers, I think it's important that we talk about these triggers. What triggered that dependency of caffeine and alcohol? It was my bout of depression. I was self-medicating with it. And so triggers can come in physical forms, such as, even hormones, right? We talked about perinatal depression. My hormones were out of control, so therefore it triggered my depression. So that could be a trigger. And then also environmental trigger, like stress, more work, or whatever transition. Like in this case, I was turning 40, right? So I developed that. So there's a lot of things that we need to keep in mind and reflect on our daily behavior. Check every day, what do you do on a daily basis, and what are the things that you cannot function without? And then you'll find your addiction. But I think as human beings, we all have addictive personalities. I mean, we all like that sense of satisfaction and pleasure. So I think it's important to understand that. In my case, I use alcohol in order to cope with my depressive. Right. So that was my coping mechanism, which obviously,
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like you were really in this cycle, right? And we're talking about with like addiction, and then another form of addiction like caffeine, but then it's also helping you almost like avoid and cope with the depression, which is also cycling. So it sounds like there's, a lot cycling through.
Absolutely. Yes.
And Norma, could you tell us a little bit about how you recognized that alcoholism was an unhealthy addiction for you?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, I didn't know I had a family history of alcoholism. And when I we talked about perinatal depression in the last episode and me dealing with depression, but because I was pregnant at the time, I couldn't self-medicate with unhealthy substances, right? Because it would affect the baby, although that happens too. But in my case, I didn't. So when I turned 40 and I developed another bout of depression, went through another bout of depression, I then was choosing to use alcohol and caffeine. Again, those are the two substances that I was using to get me through this depression. And so I can't change what happened to me, but I can help others kind of understand, or at least share my story, so others, if they're going through that right now, they can go, oh my gosh, that's exactly how I feel. So they can relate to it. And so it becomes less isolating situation. As we mentioned before, I am not a mental health or medical professional. So this is strictly my own personal story and understanding about addiction. But basically, when I recognized that I had this, is when I had a moment of what we call it in the in the recovery process, a moment of clarity, when I realized that I was using alcohol as a way to suppress my emotions. And what happened is, at the beginning, again, I would drink a ton of caffeine during the day, and then at a certain time, let's say 5 p.m., I would start drinking alcohol, right, to just wind down, unwind, or whatever. What I started noticing is that I would start consuming alcohol at earlier times during the day, right? So now it was for lunch, during lunchtime, or earlier, before 5 o'clock, or I would consume alcohol when I was going to, on the weekends, to a baseball game with my family or something like that. So that's when, and actually I will tell you that I didn't recognize it. My close family members recognized that there was something wrong with me, that I was consuming, that I had a problem, right? And they would bring it up to me. It's like, you have a problem with alcohol, you can't handle your alcohol, you shouldn't be drinking. But I was like, no, I'm fine. I've always been fine. Well, not fine, but I didn't recognize that I was in the moment of addiction. So what happened is, now I was so dependent on this substance that I needed to have it every single day. And because I would use it during earlier times, I would use it during the week, like say at noontime, right, for lunchtime. Who needs to start drinking alcohol? Then all of a sudden I had this moment of clarity where I watched myself and recognize my behavior and go, okay, now I have a problem. And I became very depressed once I found this out. So I quickly looked into, at the time I had Kaiser Permanente insurance. So I quickly called them and checked myself into the outpatient recovery program at Kaiser Permanente here in Vallejo, which I highly recommend. I wish anybody could go to that amazing recovery program, because it teaches you not just about substance using addiction, but it teaches you about human nature. So like I told you before, we all have an addictive personality. It's just part of human nature. Because we all have to be addicted to something. Some of that's addicted to love. I'm addicted to love movies. I won't watch violent movies, but I love to watch a love story, right? Why? Because when I watch a love story, it releases that sense of pleasure and satisfaction in my brain. It releases my dopamine, the dopamine in my brain. And so it gives me that. So then when I'm under a lot of stress or depressed or whatever, that's one of my tools in my toolbox, is watching a love story or going for a walk, right? Is when this addiction becomes something more, something where you can't function during the day, that you must have it then is when it just really becomes an unhealthy addiction. And so when this becomes unhealthy is, like I said, once it takes over our daily lives. And so I think that it's important that we understand this, and so that we can then find the help that we need. I'm telling you, the research, because I do a lot of research around physical activity, and this is when I recognize that even exercising can be an addictive personality, and it really brings unhealthy consequences later in our lives. And so I think that for everyone to really watch your daily behavior, like what do you do on a daily basis, and maybe even write them down, right? What must you have on a daily basis? What can you not live without? And then assess that, and then make changes if needed. And I tell you a funny story now. I shared with you that I became a born again Christian 5 years ago, and so I found Jesus is in my heart now. Oh, I'm in Christ now, and I'm a believer. And so if you ask my family now what I'm addicted to, I'm addicted to Jesus, right? Because when I connect daily with my faith and scripture and the word and the Bible, and I listen to gospel music and all of that, I get this sense of pleasure and satisfaction, and it brings me happiness, right? Which is, again, the release of dopamine in my brain. And so but that can be addictive if you take it to the extreme. But to me, my new addiction in my laugh about it. Yeah, Mom, you're addicted to Jesus now. So
I love that.
That's kind of what. Yeah. So anyway, so just to close this for everyone is just to make a daily assessment of your behavior. Write it down. Is there something on your daily activities that it might be addictive? Movies. I mean, I tell you right now, I just had 2 cups of coffee. I usually drink 1 cup of coffee, so having a second cup of coffee is something that I usually don't do. And because I'm doing it now, I'm like, but it's okay, right? I'm very aware of it. So once I capture that behavior that is not, is it gonna kill me? Well, who knows, might kill me. But anyways, if it's not gonna kill me, but I don't like it, then I might as well, figure out how to kind of move my behavior in a different way. What can I do instead of having that second cup of coffee? Maybe have some tea or hot water or with lemon, or make a concoction that, will give me kind of, because it really is drinking a hot beverage. So maybe change it. So I just have to be so aware of that, so that then I don't become addicted to caffeine again, because then that leads me to unhealthy results and consequences.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Norma, for sharing. And I think like what you just said, it's just like we have to be self-aware, and then at the point that you think it's not healthy, seek help. And on that note, I just want to go to your thank you slide, and just to show that if you, first of all, if you want to get in contact with Norma, her information is here, as well as Innovative Health Solutions, social media and website. And if you're looking for mental or emotional health resources, which also include resources for substance use, you can always contact us at SolanoConnex.org, which is spelled CONNEX.org. And I also want to say again, thank you, Norma, for sharing your journey with addiction with us, and as well as your recovery. And tune in next week for the final episode of our May is Mental Health Awareness Month series, which will be about moving forward.
Thank you both. Again, always a pleasure to share my story with everyone. And as I mentioned, please reach out, contact me. My contact is on the screen. You're not alone. We're all dealing with addictions, healthy or unhealthy. I mean, really, an addiction. Is any addiction healthy? I don't know. But thank you all.